So just that you know. Again, I would like to introduce you now to Dr. Laurel Weldon with her presentation on the logics of gender justice, a global analysis of women's rights. Dr. Weldon.
Thank you. I want to thank Bettina and all the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, or FASS, people who helped me organize today's talk. It's really nice to be able to share my research with you, and I hope I'll get to meet some of you in person at some point. And I do also appreciate Bettina's land acknowledgement, and I want to underline that land acknowledgement also before I start. So my talk today is called The Logics of Gender Justice, and it's, as the title illustrates, a global analysis of women's rights. And my talk today is based on a book that I wrote together with Multidimensional. It's published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And of course, today I'll only be able to talk about a little tiny, weeny little part of it. And I encourage you to look at the whole book if you want, or to come talk to me at some point, or contact me so that we can chat more about the results sometime. But now I can't move my slide, Bettina. Oh, can't hear you.
You either click on the slide, or you click on your keyboard to move forward.
Oh, I see. There we go. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to start by talking about why I got interested in this research in the first place, and why I wrote this book with Mala in particular. And one of the things that we talked about was we worked on different issues. I worked mainly on violence against women, and she worked mainly on questions of abortion and divorce in Latin America. And I worked in kind of looking at European and more developed countries, India, a few other areas. And we found that we had very different, partly because of what we studied, we had very different ideas about what made governments do different things for women's rights, partly because we studied different regions, partly because we studied different kinds of issues. And the more we talked to each other, the more we found it quite puzzling, that actually some of the governments that were good on some of the issues that we studied were not good in others. I was already interested because I studied the Nordic region, and I had a lot of background in Canadian and American politics, as well as Australia, that some countries, some governments in some countries were doing, really progressive or kind of innovative things on women's rights in one area, but they wouldn't be doing it in another area. So for example, the Nordic countries were really doing these interesting things in parental leave, really generous parental leaves, years of paid leave, and this kind of daddy leave that's non-transferable from the father to the mother was very old, established in Norway in 1993. And in Canada and in the US in particular, take the US, no paid leave at all at this point, right? So it's kind of a big contrast. Why would that be? You might say, well, maybe the US is just really not very good for women's rights or something like that, right? Maybe Canada kind of lags behind. But then when we talk about violence against women, Canada, Australia, the United States lead the world, right, in innovative policies to address violence against women. So that's kind of puzzling. Why so good in one area and not in another of women's rights? So another thing that we always hear is, kind of modernization, like rich countries do better than poor countries. But then the more we looked into women's rights, the more we noticed, the richer countries weren't always more progressive than the poorer countries on certain issues. So for example, looking at violence against women in the 1990s, we noticed that Brazil and Argentina were adopting innovative policies. You may have even heard of the women's police stations in Brazil, which were kind of a big policy innovation there in the 80s, by the end of the 90s. Finland, Italy, and Spain were really not doing much at all to address violence against women. These kind of wealthy European countries, you'd think they'd be similar, Spanish background, but not doing anything. So kind of similar kind of puzzles there. Last, like political scientists look a lot at kind of regional things that happen in a region, like the Middle East or Nordic countries, right? Or countries that share a same religious kind of orientation. What's the predominant religion? We ask these kinds of questions when we're trying to understand comparative policy, comparative welfare policy. And the thing is that, again, it doesn't help us understand variation as much as you might think to look at these kinds of groupings. Because, for example, Turkey and Morocco overhaul family law, start to react to violence against women. Saudi Arabia literally does nothing. These are both Islamic countries. Even more interesting, if you expand it to like the global family of countries that are predominantly Islamic, Iran and Indonesia are the only ones that entrench greater inequality over time in family law. Every other country is liberalizing its family law, including the Islamic countries. But two, put greater inequality in family law. Why is that? Why does that happen? It's obviously not just religion, right? Because there's difference across these religious countries that are the same religion. The same with Ireland and Italy on abortion and violence against women. Catholic countries, predominantly Catholic. Ireland had for a long time, was distinguished as being the only advanced industrialized country that had a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion in all circumstances, even to save a woman's life. Now that's changed. But at the same time, Italy, fully legal, fully funded access to abortion. Why the difference? So these were the puzzles that we were sort of thinking about as we started this project. So you might say to yourself, you know, what explains these differences? And, you know, everybody can kind of think about, you know, what's the difference between, you know, Ireland and Italy? What's the difference? So you might think, well, what kinds of things might explain it, do you think? Why do you think that you might see those differences? It's sort of interesting to think about it. And it's pretty complicated, right? Because a lot of the things you think might be obvious answers can't work. So whenever I say this, here, hold on, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, hold on, I'm gonna start again. Play from start, okay. So this is going differently then. Okay, so if we want to say why we would explain these differences, really it's a trick question, right? There's no explanatory factor. There's no single explanatory factor. There can't be, right? So if we think about the fact, this point that I made at the very beginning about how one country has different outcomes depending on the different issue areas, what that means is that it can't be one thing that explains those different issue areas, right? Because it's the same country, right? So if the US is good on violence against women and lousy on parental leave, it can't be that it's because it's a rich country or it has so many women in government or whatever. I have a picture here of the last Congress to kind of just illustrate the point. That's the US Parliament. To kind of illustrate the point that, you know, however many women there are there can't be the same, it's the same country, right? It can't be the same reason why at the same time it has a good policy in one area and a lousy policy in another. So similarly, while, you know, Sweden is adopting this really great parental leave in the mid-90s, it's denying that violence against women is really a big problem. Yeah? So it's kind of a strange thing. So there's lots of women in government. They can't be explanations for both outcomes, can they? Right? So it's kind of confusing. But if we think that way, that means that all the easy answers that come to our minds, the richer countries, more modern countries, more democratic countries, it can't be women in government. It can't just be that, oh, these are patriarchal countries or that they're male dominated. All countries are male dominated, right? And even like, you know, again, one country, being the same country that's male dominated has different outcomes in two different areas. Why are there differences across areas? It can't just be that feminists are mobilized even, right? That's my favorite explanation, as you'll see, because in these countries, there's variation across issues. So we have to get more complicated and more sophisticated in thinking about the answers. Okay, so to try to give us the basis for doing this, we did a global study. We looked at 70 countries from 1975 to 2005, and we looked at 7 different issue areas for the big study. So I can say more about exactly what we did. And what we really came up with is the idea that gender politics is multidimensional. And by that we mean that you can't just say, okay, it's a one-story thing going on, right? It depends not just on gender, but also on whether issues are defined by class, whether they're defined by nation, whether they're defined by religion. If they're inflected with issues, you know, dimensions of class, nation, and religion, or one or all of these things, they make the story more complicated, as you might imagine. And the other thing is that it's not always the case that these dimensions are related to each other in a simple fashion. Sometimes being, you know, doing a very good job of addressing class inequality may not mean that you do a great job of addressing divisions based on religion, right, or based on nation, right? So there's different dimensions and they don't necessarily relate to each other. And by dimensions here, I mean like one of the ways that we organize society. They're just talking about the way we structure society. So why do I bother talking about these different dimensions? Well, because I think if we put them together and if we think about them in a kind of organized way, it helps us understand some of the puzzles that I just outlined. So let me explain what I mean. So first of all, if we ask about, you know, how does religion play into these issues? We can say, does the issue that we're talking about challenge the doctrine of the dominant religion in that country? If it does, we can consider the issue doctrinal, and if it doesn't, we say it's not doctrinal. So really, we're looking here contextually, right? In that country, Does this issue challenge the religious doctrine of an established religious institution? So that means it's going to be, if it does, it means it's going to be kind of salient, but it might not, right? In which case it's not a doctrinal issue. A women's rights issue may not be a doctrinal issue. Similarly, some gender issues and some women's rights issues might be kind of inflected with class. They might be issues that really challenge the ways that states and markets are organized. And if they are, well, that gets a whole bunch of different actors involved in the issue. If it doesn't, those actors may more or less stay out of the issue, right? So some gender issues involve these kinds of class dimensions and some don't. So here are some examples. If we put this 2x2 table, class issues and doctrinal issues, all of these issues are gender issues, but some of them also challenge religious institutions, and some challenge institutionalized relations of state market. So if we put that in a 2x2 like this table here, we get 4 categories of issues. The ones in the top left are called gender status issues. The ones immediately to the right of that are called doctrinal issues because they just have to do with this challenging of religious institutions. The ones at the bottom there on the left are class issues. And the ones in the bottom right-hand corner are both class issues and doctrinal issues. So this gives us 4 different categories of issues. And how does that help us? Well, if for each of these categories, we can think about different actors that are likely to be activated. So for example, for status issues, which tend to be new issues that feminists themselves have to articulate, we see that organized feminism matters. They put new issues on the agenda, and they don't always matter because opposition and support varies, but they're critical parts of this process. For those gender issues that are inflected with class, as I mentioned before, again, we want to look at the pattern of state-market relations. For example, how are social policies organized? What kinds of generous welfare policies are there to support people? Also, how mobilized are left parties? Are there unions? How usual is it to involve them in government policy? So all these kinds of questions are things that come up if it's a class issue. If it's a religious issue, then we want to ask about state-church relationships. And we're really focused here in our project, not just on whether, what religion it is or how religious the country is. Those things matter a little. But the thing that really makes a difference, we argue, is this the institutional dimension of religion. So by this, we mean, for example, the difference between, say, Ireland, where the government establishes religion through the constitution. Religious education is mandated in schools at state expense, versus, say, the United States, which mandates the separation of church and state, separation of mosque and state, separation of every kind of religion from the state, right? And the idea is that you keep religion out of your public institutions. That's at least the idea that's enshrined in the Constitution. But very different patterns of the relationship between church and state, to use a kind of stylized language. Last, international norms on human rights and human rights conventions and other kinds of important international principles can influence these different issues, and they tend to influence status policies the most. Okay, so if we just kind of map what I just said onto those 4 categories, these are our expectations that we would see in these different kinds of issues. Feminist movements and international norms matter for status issues. The feminist movements, religious institutions, and other kinds of religious variables. Colonialism and communism matter here because of the way they structure the state-church relationship. For class issues, left parties, labor movements, and feminist movements, and for class and doctrinal issues, all of these kinds of usual suspects matter. Okay, so how did we explore this? What was our kind of evidence that we used to kind of analyze this issue? We used a combination of qualitative and quantitative data to examine this question. We first of all generated a primary data set of women's rights in 70 countries over the period I mentioned. I could say more in the question period if you want to know about that. And we also did field work in a series of countries as well: Argentina, Israel, Nigeria, other countries, which we drew on as well in our analyses. Okay, so let me tell you, I'm going to tell you 2 stories. If you want in the question period, maybe I can come back to a third one. But I want to tell you 2 stories just to illustrate the kinds of contrast I'm going to try to draw out in the rest of my presentation. First story I want to tell you is about government action on violence against women in Canada and Sweden in the 1980s and 1990s, which were the big periods of formulating policy in this area. That's a status issue. Remember, that's the top left-hand corner in the table I showed you. And the second little story I'm going to tell you in a minute is about Morocco's 2004 reform of family code, family law. This is a doctrinal issue, right? It's an issue where the advancing women's rights challenges the doctrine of the established religion. So I want to tell you those two stories, and I'm happy to tell you more about some of these other examples too, if you want after. So let me start with Canada and Sweden in the 80s and 90s. And one of the points I want to make is that over the 80s and 90s in both Canada and Sweden, there are feminists present who are demanding change on the issue of violence against women. And you can see that from these pictures. But in Canada, it goes back much earlier. In fact, Canada is one of the earliest places in the world to have violence against women on the public agenda. And in 1967, the Royal Commission on Status of Women was actually criticized by Canadian feminists for not including enough about violence against women in its 100 recommendations. So already here in Canada, in civil society, there are these organized feminist groups that are demanding that government action pay attention to violence against women. Just a bit more than a decade later, the Secretary of State Women's Program is funding important research by women's organizations. And women's organizations do this really groundbreaking research on domestic violence and on violence against women. And this research leads to a series of amendments. And so, for example, the Rape Shield Law is very quickly adopted in 1983. Very surprisingly in some ways, right? No discussion. And actually, the law itself reflects the proposal that came from the National Association of Women in the Law and was endorsed by the National Action Committee, or NAC as it was called, on the status of women, which was an umbrella group of women's organizations here in Canada. And this forms the basis for the amendment. So sometimes you get asked, how do you know that feminists had the influence that you're saying they do? And in this case, we know because the actual proposal that was written by these groups became law. So it's one of those things where the fingerprints of the people who did the law were all over the final proposal. And a similar kind of process in 1991, there was this consultation on what was called the No Means No Sexual Assault Law. Again, a kind of process of consultation with women's organizations, and this law is passed. One thing I just want to mention about these two important developments in Canada was that during the time that these developments took place, women were less than 10% of parliament for most of the big expansions. And the other thing I want to mention is that it took place under liberal governments and it took place under conservative governments. So not really particularly left parties. So I'm flagging that because you'll see it's quite different than Sweden in the same period. Again, in Sweden, there are feminists who are trying to get action on violence against women, but they were really characterized as shrill and divisive and dismissed by people working in government offices, even in equality offices, and even in offices working for women's rights. And in Sweden, protective orders, which are kind of like measures that women can go to be protected from violent partners, weren't adopted until a decade later than they were adopted in Canada, the United States, and the UK, where they were put in place in the late 1970s. Also in Sweden around this same time, there's no public support for specialized rape crisis centers. There are very few. I mean, really, some people find, the Nordic countries have this reputation for being the women-friendly welfare states. But what I'll say is that as late as 2011, there's this legal category of minor rape for drunk or unconscious women who are assaulted with no required penalty. And this is just one example, but there is an absolutely scathing Amnesty International report from 2010, which absolutely excoriates the rape laws across the Nordic region. And if you're one of these people who thinks that the Nordic countries are always ahead in all areas, I encourage you to read this report from Amnesty, which really showed that the Nordic countries were really behind when it came to legal reforms in the area of violence against women. So, we have all this need for legal reform. People are denying that violence happens. And by the way, there is research that's showing it's at the same level as it is in Canada and the United States at the same time. So this idea that doesn't really happen in Sweden isn't true, just in case you might have thought that seemed plausible. And at the same time as this happening, again, in contrast, there's 27 to 40% of women in parliament, and there are left parties in power. So what are we seeing? What's going on in Sweden? Why aren't we seeing any action on violence against women? We have left parties, we have women in government, we have women demanding change. And so one big difference to keep in mind is that there's not an autonomous feminist movement, and it's not strong. The feminist movement is mostly kind of encompassed inside the political parties, it's inside state government. There's not a lot of independent feminist civil society organizing with a capacity to kind of criticize government and demand attention to feminist issues. They mostly are internal to those organizations that are demanding change. So it makes it very difficult for those feminist critics to kind of criticize their own parties, their own bosses in many cases, when they're inside government in this way. So there's no autonomous movement, and it ends up not really having the kind of strength and independence to criticize government in the public sphere, like in Canada, where it happened constantly. Okay, so this is the one I'm going to skip over for now, but I love talking about it. I'm happy to come back to talking about work family policies and legal status at work. But just to kind of draw a contrast with some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, I want to talk to you about Moroccan family law and how the family code in Morocco was overhauled in 2004. And it really became what some people consider to be like kind of a model for like feminist law that can be accomplished within the kind of framework of Sharia, because it established equality in a wide range of areas in family law, which has been a real hard nut to crack. So again, why did this happen? Well, even in the early 1990s, there's women's movement organizing in Morocco. And in fact, there's a very famous campaign called the 1 Million Signatures campaign that's emulated in other places, Iran, other places, where other countries, because people want to emulate this high profile, strong movement. In response, in 1993, the government tries to adopt some modest reforms, which the feminists are not too satisfied with. The government also ratifies the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. This is the main women's rights convention, kind of international bill of women's rights. And as part of the CEDAW process, you have to make a report to this international committee that then tells you if you're doing a good job of living up to the standards. And many countries underestimate the power of this law. So in 1997, Morocco goes to the CEDAW conference and finds itself criticized for not living up to the goals of equality in family law that have been articulated. And the women's movement can actually criticize its own government at these international meetings. So it embarrassed the government tremendously. And in 1999, the socialists in power in Morocco proposed a reform, but they met with protest from Islamists at home, and the protests were so severe that they shelved their policy proposals. Well, in 2003, a new kind of reform-minded king came into power, and with feminist pressure, the policies were kind of revived. But what really made the difference was that there was a terrorist attack that undercut the legitimacy of the kind of Islamic leaders in Morocco. And so they actually were anxious to try to build their own legitimacy, and they agreed to something they wouldn't have agreed to before, which was to participate in this reform process. So this huge reform took place with the support of the Islamic authorities in Morocco and the participation of feminist activists. So to just make that point about in Morocco, the story I'm telling you is a very different story than the story I was telling you about violence against women in Canada and Sweden, right? Different things are mattering, different actors are mattering. We didn't talk about religion when we talked about violence against women in Canada and Sweden at all. And part of that is because of the issue. So let me show you a bit more about what I mean. So if we just, first of all, show you like how policies vary, I want to just give you an illustration of how different they are across different issues. Let's take, this is all the issues we have in our study, but let's look first at violence against women, which is a status issue, and compare it to family law, which is a doctrinal issue. So if we look at government patterns, global patterns in government response to redress violence against women, I'm just making sure I'm not talking too long. Global patterns in government response to address violence against women in these 70 countries from 1975 to 2005, we can look at an index that summarizes how expansive government response is, with 10 being more expansive policies to address violence against women and 0 being less expansive policies. And so here is the details of the index we created to measure government action. Encompasses things like services to victims, legal reform, policies or programs targeted to violence against women, training professionals, prevention programs, and then administrative reforms that make all of these kind of policies and programs work together. And again, I can tell you more about that if you want. So if we look at 1975, so the thing I want you to notice, you might say, okay, this is just a map of the world. Really, that's kind of what I want you to notice, that in 1975, pretty much the same story around the whole world. Not much action on violence against women any place really in our study. Pretty much minimal to no action everywhere. Nothing's really happening in 1975. By 1985, you can see that we're starting to see some government action on violence against women in some areas. That's Canada, the United States, and Australia. We do see Sweden undertaking some action here. That's in Europe, Sweden, Britain, France. So we see the beginning of some government action on violence against women. By 95, you can see completely starting to be really a lot more variation. Canada, the United States, and Australia are already at the top of this index that we developed to try to kind of, having kind of done all the things that we were looking for in the area of violence against women. But you can see that in most of Africa, the governments we looked at there are doing literally nothing more than they were doing in 1975. The same is true for the whole post-communist region. At this point, it's the post-communist region. The Middle East, North Africa region, that's what MENA stands for down there. Middle East, North Africa region, again, not much is happening. In East Asia, not very much action at all. And look at Europe. Again, even though there are a few countries where we're seeing slightly more action, Latin America as a region is looking more progressive than Europe. There's a lot of action. Italy, a lot of other countries in Europe where literally nothing is happening on violence against women. That's the example I gave you at the beginning, right? Oops. Okay. So anyway, by 2005, we just see a little bit more convergence on that issue. If we look at family law, we can also use a similar kind of way to kind of capture reform equality, the degree to which governments are promoting equality in family law. And for this index, again, higher scores are more equality, lower scores are less equality, and our index ranges from 1 to 13. And here are the areas of family law that this reflects. Age of marriage, is it the same? Do men and women have to give consent to marriage? Are the spousal rights and obligations in marriage the same? Some of these have quite a lot of areas. Inheritance rights, rights to work without the permission of your male relative, the right to initiate divorce, the same for women and men, custody of children, so on. So if we look at that, here, if we look at 1975, remember what I told you about when we looked at the first slide for violence against women? It was the same across the whole world. But for family law, you can see it's quite different in each of these countries, right? You can see the variation here. There's some high degree of inequality in some areas and kind of lower degree of inequality in others. Interestingly, you'll see that the kind of former Soviet Union, and here it is the actual Soviet Union still in 1975, has a very high degree of equality in family law over this period. Remember that they're doing nothing in the area of violence against women, even through the mid-1990s, where I showed you that before. So again, this is kind of making the point about being very different across issues. So 1975, we see a lot of variation. 1985, you're starting to see more countries in the world are moving kind of up this ladder of equality. The Middle East, North Africa region is the region where it looks like there's the most stickiness, right? We're not seeing as much policy action. But in 1985, most of the rest of the world has started to reform family law. By 1995, you see a lot of this dark blue area around the whole world. Again, post-communist areas are like this from the very beginning of the period. But meanwhile, the rest of the world, again, with the exception of a few areas of the Middle East, North Africa region, are advancing here. By 2005, most of the world really is converging on these higher levels of equality, again, with just a few countries left in the Middle East, North Africa, a few countries in East Asia at those lower levels. But we see a tremendous amount of convergence. So in some ways, the story is quite opposite to violence against women, where we saw a lot of the similarity at the beginning and then variation emerges over the period. In this area, family law, we start with quite a lot of variation at the beginning. And by 2005, most countries are kind of converging on equality in family law, with some exceptions. Okay, so these are just kind of pictures, but we could also use a statistical analysis. One of the nice things about having these little indices to measure the extent of women's rights is that we can use it to examine, we can use statistical analysis to look at associations a bit more systematically and to really look at all these complicated factors that I mentioned before. So one of the things that we do in the book, of course, we do a lot more stuff, so I'm only going to be able to present a teeny tiny part of it right now. But one of the things we do in the book is we say, look what happens if we take the same statistical model, the same kind of explanation, and apply it to all the areas that we're talking about over these for these 70 countries over these years. What do we see? And one of the things that we see is that you get different results for each area. So you don't see the same answer for every area. And that becomes more pronounced the more you spend time analyzing each area on its own rights, but I can't show you all that stuff today. But I'll just show you the one comparison, and I'll skip through it a little bit because it's kind of hard to go through a statistical analysis in this context, but I'll just pull a few things out and highlight them. And in these tables that I'm about to show you, I'm going to kind of pull out and try to bold or blow up variables that are statistically significant. Okay, this uses a kind of analysis called panel data analysis, and I'm happy to tell you more about statistical analysis in the question and answer if you want to hear it. Okay, so all of the models take all of these explanatory factors into account. Feminist movements, women's commissions, whether or not they ratified that women's convention I mentioned, CEDAW, constitutionally established religion, other religious variables, denominations, whether there are left parties in government, whether the country is a former colony or communist legacy, and then control variables. How rich is the country? How democratic? How many women in government? We looked at these models for all these different areas of women's rights. Again, for each area to kind of make it more comparable, we normed it so that every variable is measured 0 to 10 for this analysis. And we looked at all these areas here, which I'll show you in a table in a minute, but then I'm going to go into talking about a couple of them in more detail. So you'll see some of the things that we talked about. So this is the big table, which I will pull out and talk about a bit more. But you can see just from looking at the bolded coefficients here, what that indicates is that that factor that's underneath the left column, for example, strong autonomous women's movement across the top, that factor is significant, statistically significant. It matters. It's a good predictor of the outcome in that particular model. So if you can look down, you can see that some of these factors are good and are significant in some models and not others. What that's telling us is they're good predictors of some of these outcomes and not others. In some cases, you see positive signs, and in some cases, you see negative signs. Where there's a positive sign, it means that the factor on the left is associated with, and it's bold, it's associated with more of that outcome, right? So it's more associated with more government action on violence against women or equality at work. Across the top, you see the different types of issues, the indexes for each of these issues. And if it's negative, it means that you have less equality in these areas, less women's rights in each area. Let me take some of these things out a little bit more to explain them. So in that table, what you see there is basically the finding that feminist movements are good predictors. They're important for advancing sex equality in each policy area, except for family leave. But they matter in different ways in each area. In most of these cases, they're really needed to articulate women's distinctive concerns or those of a subgroup of women. But sometimes where reform of well-established legal frames is necessary, or if there's opposition to overcome, even strong movements can take longer to have an impact. And that's why sometimes we have a lagged variable in that, meaning that we look at the overtime impact more. So here's the strong autonomous women's movement, one variable here. Now, I'll just show you one example of what it would look like if we looked at each issue area specifically. So in this kind of statistical analysis that I'm showing you here, what we did was look at just violence against women by itself. So all of these models are for one type of policy area, that is policy areas on violence against women. And what we're trying to show you here is that feminist movements matter, but they matter particularly in combination with whether the government has ratified that convention on the elimination of status against women. So kind of like the Morocco story, but that happens a lot for violence against women. A government prom signs on to CEDAW, and then this happened in Nigeria a lot. A lot of the women's organizations are using that bill to say, you didn't live up to the promises. You said you were going to recognize women's human rights, but you're not doing anything about violence against women. Okay, so that kind of interaction is significant. That's what that one row tells us. On religion, and it's always, I love talking about our religion findings. I'm happy to talk more about them in the question and answer. But the thing I really want to emphasize here is that it's the institutional elements of religion that matter. And this is the great thing about statistical analysis and multivariate analysis, is we can ask what matters most, what looks like it drives the bus here. And the thing that is most important, sure, it matters if the country is, you know, a Muslim country or a Catholic country, because, for example, if it's a Buddhist country, the position, or a Hindu country, it might not matter so much if abortion is legal or illegal, right? It's different kind of background and cultural valence for that issue. But in a Catholic country, that matters. If it affects, religion matters for whether countries, whether abortion is legal or illegal. But it's not just whether it's Catholic, and it's not just how religious people are. It matters if that kind of religiosity and expression of religious concern is expressed through political institutions. So where those, like in Ireland, where it's fixed in constitutional establishment, it presents an obstacle to legal reform. So we have some interesting, and where it's separated, it's easier to reform. So if you want to understand, for example, differences across Islamic countries or differences across Catholic countries, you have to pay attention to not just whether it's Catholic or Islamic, not whether how religious the country is, but what is the kind of institutional structure of church and state, mosque and state, or temple and state, or whatever you happen to be looking at. Okay, so this is just kind of showing you this in statistical analysis. You can see that the presence of official religion is mostly negative for these issues, not for leave generosity, which is what we would have expected anyway, in terms of these different kind of issues. I can say more about the communism and colonialism. And if we look at the kind of another variable we have that's not in this model, which has to do with religious law, how much does the law adopt religion? It's more important that you can see than religiosity in this analysis. Okay. And this is just another way of showing you the same thing, that if you really want to get a handle on the difference, for example, between Muslim and non-Muslim countries, or religious or non-religious countries, the thing you really want to look at is institutions. Here we have, social scientists love it when you have something that looks like a nice, clusters around a nice straight line, and that's what we have here. I can show you these again if you want afterwards. Okay. So the last point I want to make here is about left parties. And left parties matter in our models for all issues, but really, they really matter mostly for these class-based issues that I mentioned before. And you can really see the difference if you start looking at the details about the difference between the issue of abortion legality and funding for abortion and funding for contraception. What you see is that you know, this is where the role of left parties really matters. So for legality, religion is really an issue, but for funding, left parties come into it. And so the bigger point here is that women's rights are not a single basket of issues, and that in order to really understand them, we have to disaggregate them and look at them in these different categories that we talked about. And then when we're looking at something that's mainly a status issue, it's feminist movements that matter the most in terms of determining the outcome. But when we're talking about things that are doctrinal issues, religion and the institutional context of religion is a critical element that we can't ignore. And when we're talking about class issues, we have to pay attention to these kinds of actors and institutions of class politics. Parties, left parties, unions, you know, business hegemony, these kinds of things are the kinds of things that matter for class issues. And international norms like CEDAW matter more when they're unopposed domestically or fit with domestic values or goals. So if I go back to those puzzles I started at the beginning, hopefully now you can see why we came to some answers for those. If we want to know why governments' progressiveness vary across countries, why are the Nordic countries good on parental leave and not violence against women? Well, the answer, as we saw in the Canada-Sweden example, is the autonomy of women's movements. There are regional agreements in Latin America, kind of like these like the convention I talked about, that matters a lot for explaining why Latin America is more progressive than Europe when it comes to violence against women. It has to do with these international pressures. And really why the Nordic countries are so much better than, say, the US or Canada or Australia on family leave is because of the influence of left parties in those systems. The fact is the US has no left party, and that's why it has the worst maternity leave in the developed world. Richer countries are not always more progressive than poorer countries. Again, as we've said, regional agreements in Latin America and transnational connections explain why Latin America is more advanced than Europe, and really being wealthy or not didn't come into our analyses very much at all. And last, when we were asking about why do region, religion, and family of nations seem to matter so much less than you might think, again, part of the reason here has to do with the institutional dimensions of religion. When we're putting too much on religiosity or too much on the type of religion, we're never going to be able to get a grip on what exactly makes the difference. It has to do, these institutional structures are very important. Again, that is kind of like the relationship between church and state. Do you have by law a particular kind of religion that's mandated? Or can you say you cannot be forced by law to undertake any particular religious activity, or are you protected by law in the protection of your religious activity? Those are all different ways of institutionalizing religion. Okay, so just to say that this multidimensional approach to women's rights fits with what we call an intersectional way of understanding gender. And one way of kind of making that simple is just to say that women and women's rights share many things, but they're not all the same. And another thing to say, another way to think about some of the kind of practical lessons that we've been talking about here is there's an old slogan of the women's movement that says, "Women don't agonize, organize." And this also this research also kind of says there's something to that old slogan, right? In that, of course, in many cases, we need institutional reform to make a difference, but, and it might even sometimes be necessary for change, but for women's rights in general, feminist organizing is a critical dimension of change. So I'll stop there. I went a little longer than I intended, but hopefully not too long. Hopefully, I think we still should have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weldon. This was absolutely fantastic. I will stop the recording now and allow